Today, we're going to discuss one of the more contentious issues existing in our political sphere, climate change, and how that climate is changing as a result of human behavior. Whether or not you believe that might tell you if you're on the right or the left of the political spectrum in this country. Myself, a conservative Republican, and my partner Mike, who is a progressive Democrat, we work to find common ground by parsing through the data and talking about these subjects with experts. So today we have an expert with a decade of climate experience, and I'm going to leave it to him because he's going to do a lot better at describing what he's done in this field. But Spencer, please give us a little bit about your background and what you think we're going to be talking about today and some of the history behind this very important topic of climate change.
Well, thanks so much, Mike Cooper. So for your audience, my name is Spencer Schechts, and I've been working in the climate change field for nearly 10 years now. And my entry into this conversation really came from a sense of alarmism, which is pretty much where a lot of the liberal side of the conversation tends to originate. However, things have changed in the last handful of years where climate change has really risen to the top of the political discourse. And so I think it might be helpful for our audience if we could walk through a little bit of that history, where it came from. So when we were born in the late 1980s, early 1990s, this was a conversation that was just only beginning. So in 1988, there was a famous testimony by a scientist named James Hansen to the United States Congress, where he famously said, "The time to stop waffling is now. We need to do something about climate change." And he said that the greenhouse gas changes in the Earth's natural cycles has been detected, that the signal has risen above the noise. And interestingly, his research, he was looking at the planet Venus. And so in our solar system, we have the first three planets, which is Mercury, Venus, and us. And if you look at Mercury, its temperature, its average surface temperature is negative 200 degrees Celsius. But if you look at Venus, millions of miles further away from the sun, its surface temperature is nearly 900 degrees.
Can I pause you for a second? Mercury,
Sure.
I thought was like a ball of fire. Is that not accurate?
It's hot, but it's not as hot as Venus. And that's the point here. Because Venus, it all comes back to the composition of the atmosphere. And so he realized that Venus, being almost entirely CO2, was incredibly hot. And so he had this sort of epiphany moment where he realized if we keep burning all of this fossil fuel and undergoing all these processes in which we're releasing greenhouse gases into the Earth's atmosphere, we might be heading towards a future looking like Venus. And this was one of the first scientists to address this publicly, and this was the first time that these conversations came into the public discourse. And that was 1988, and that was also the year that the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change came into being as well, which was where basically top scientists from all countries are coming together and doing a literature review of the available science on climate change and issuing definitive reports on the state of the climate. So this is when things really got kicked off. And in 1992, there was a famous convening under the United Nations, and this was the Rio, I think it was called the Environment and Development Summit. And this is where the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, bear with me with all these names, the UNFCCC, came into being. And through this UNFCCC process, this is where we got the Kyoto Protocol, which was our first attempt at operationalizing our emissions reductions ambitions. And then in 2015, the Paris Agreement, which is the paradigm we live in now, in which the globe, the community of nations are coming together to raise the ambition around reducing their greenhouse gases, to try to peak greenhouse gases as soon as possible with the explicit ambition of limiting climate change to no more than 2 degrees Celsius.
So it sounds like the UN Climate Committee or the FNCCC, you are going to have to correct me on that one, but it sounds like they're kind of
UNFCCC.
UNFCCC.
Yeah, you can call it
okay. So the UNF.
I like to say the climate, but
yeah.
You
Okay,
don't have
that's
to
not
add
a
that
bad
to the
way to
final
say it,
version.
actually. Good way to remember. So it sounds like they are a group of scientists or climatologists, and they're kind of conducting studies and going after what the truth of the situation is. Is it a bipartisan committee? Are they scientists? Tell me more about that committee, because it sounds like they're the ones in charge of making these statements about what's happening.
So let's be clear. The IPCC, which releases these reports every 5 years, they're the authority. They're the knowledge authority on climate change. And that's where you might hear in the news where they say climate scientists confirm that it's getting worse, and sea level rise and droughts and heat waves and storms. That's the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which are sort of the definitive experts on climate. Then the UNFCCC is the mechanism, the platform through which countries are coming together to try to enforce and regulate these the ambitions towards greenhouse gas reduction. So you have the science with the IPCC. What do we do about it tangibly? That's the UNFCCC. And that is where we got the Paris Agreement. And I'm glad to talk a little bit more about the Paris Agreement, because you're talking right versus left. There's a lot of discourse on the right of saying, well, the Paris Agreement is going to sink the U.S. economy. It is unfair. All these different things, right?
Right.
However, the magic of the Paris Agreement is that in order for 195 countries to come together and agree to it, it needed to have this flexibility in which it is bottom up. And what defines the Paris Agreement is what's called the nationally determined contributions. And the contributions are your efforts to reduce greenhouse gases, which are driving climate change, and they are nationally determined. They're unilaterally determined. Unlike the Kyoto Protocol, which came about in the 90s, which basically said all of you developed countries, you have to do this and that. The Paris Agreement says we have a end goal. We have our new North Star, and that is aligning all of our compasses towards this decarbonization goal by mid-century. And then their nationally determined contributions are where each country steps up and says, we're going to do this and that. And other countries, say that they're going to do their own nationally determined actions towards climate change. And then they're all added up together. And then it's allowed for this review process. We review and critique. It allows for countries to see what other nations are doing. And it's this platform to move that forward.
So, Mike, I want to make sure that as we've listened to what Spencer described, right, we've gone through maybe 3-4 decades of history here, and I want to make sure that we're on the same page so we have an understanding as we go forward, right? The way that I understood it is that the Kyoto Protocol was more like individual requirements that were going to be followed up and checked on each developed nation. They were the ones that had the resources to go ahead and make change. Then, as it came in to be introduced with the Paris Climate Accords or the Paris Agreement, that kind of put this global plan into effect, where the way that I understood it, or maybe Spencer, you can help me understand how it more works, but the less developed nations that have more room for improvement but less resources can actually receive funding or something, and it's maybe this more global goal. Mike, can you help me understand how that might happen in this? I'm not really capturing what's going on.
Sure. So the whole picture is kind of looking at the whole portfolio of global carbon or just greenhouse gas emissions, right? If we're all working towards this common goal, then we can come up with shared metrics, which is part of what's going on with the Paris agreements. And then if we can come up with a unified metric on how to measure carbon produced from industrial activity, then we can get a trading system, involved, where countries that are coming up with their, personal contributions that they're going to figure out how they're going to combat climate change. That could include investing in other countries that lowers the overall carbon, footprint on the planet, because that's the end goal. So you could say that our individual contribution is to reduce X amount of gigatons over 30 years, and we're going to do that by investing in a solar project elsewhere. So one of the particular recent examples of this is, and it's quite a historic deal, it's the first one to occur, it's between Switzerland and Thailand, right? So Switzerland might not have as much land to produce these projects, or permit reasons. I'm in environmental engineering a little bit, so like for permit reasons, it might be very difficult for them to put up projects there. But Thailand has lots and lots of ambition, lots and lots of land, and lots of people that they want to dedicate to these resources. It's a good marriage between capitalism and environmentalism, where one benefits the other.
So Spencer, talk to the mechanisms behind that, and how is Thailand's advancement and making their green sustainable technology more prolific, how does that have any effect on Switzerland? I'm not able to square that circle, honestly.
So climate change is a global issue. And so if you're emitting carbon in somewhere in the world, if China's emitting carbon, it's affecting the global climate, which is going to affect every other nation. So if we can find a way to address emissions mitigations, and emissions mitigations, I hope this is not losing people. That just means you're lowering the amount of greenhouse gases that you're producing in any given process. If you're able to produce emissions mitigation at a lower marginal cost elsewhere, that's just classical economics. That's the reason it's cheaper to make your widgets elsewhere in China than it is maybe to have them American made. So if Switzerland can identify, we can take credit for Thailand's emissions mitigation and pay them for it, and it's actually cheaper for us to pay Thailand for it. To us, it's cheaper. To Thailand, it's a deal. They're saying, okay, we could find emissions mitigations elsewhere to meet our nationally determined contributions, and we could help finance it with this Swiss money. So this is getting into this international carbon market. And so right now there exist multiple carbon markets across the world. There's what's called the compliance markets, which is essentially what you have in the EU, the European Union, the UK, and Canada. They're the only folks that have this compliance market. You have to reduce your emissions according to the market. And then there's voluntary carbon markets, which is a little bit of a Wild West, so to speak, right now, where you're seeing big technology players. So you might hear about this, Amazon or Microsoft are buying these carbon credits off of these voluntary markets in order to help meet their individual corporate goals of reducing emissions. So it gets a little bit complicated, and even the experts in the field will tell you it gets a little complicated, it gets a little messy, but the idea is these are financing mechanisms. If Switzerland is saying, we're going to take credit for this, for Thailand's emissions mitigation, and we could pay them for it, and Thailand says, that's a deal for us because we could find these mitigations elsewhere, then it works out for everyone. And it's this idea of enabling the lowest cost emissions mitigations that you could get.
Right. So we're looking at the result on a global scale instead of an individualized country scale, which does make sense to me in a way. Cool. However, to be skeptical, right, it does sound like in this specific instance, Switzerland may not have improved their emissions, right? All they did was reduce their pocketbooks. So if let's look at a country like China or India or the United States even that are huge offenders of this, presumably they are permitted under this plan to continue to keep offending, right? If China and India are pumping pollution into the sky and the oceans as fast as possible, but then they're just writing checks, what are they doing at home, or what is the mechanism at home to help them or compel them to make these changes that we all agree, or that's another topic we should get to, is whether or not we all agree, right? But in fact, that's a statistic. I'll put it up on the screen. Only 14%. There was an AI study done. They actually scraped Twitter accounts. It's like 14.8% of people still believe that the climate is not changing or that it's not due to humans. And I posted that stat on my Twitter page this week. And of course, people commented, oh, humans aren't doing it. The only way they could change the climate is through thermonuclear war. It's not happening, and I kind of posted that stat, and it goes on to say, well, if you're right leaning and you're low income and low education and, not anti-vax, you probably do believe that the climate isn't changing. So it is becoming this, it's almost like, it's a pariah, right? It's used as this kind of boogeyman. But what I've kind of saw is that, and you mentioned at the beginning, right, the alarmism that's coming out of folks like AOC or Greta Thunberg, it almost creates a knee-jerk reaction to say, oh, they're being so ridiculous, I'm not going to pay any attention to them. And that's, I think, what you're seeing on that 14 or 15%. They're just totally disregarding it because they're calling it BS, when maybe it's not. There's obviously somewhere in the middle ground where we need to find these, solutions that obviously, well, maybe they do exist, maybe they don't. So it sounds like the issue is CO2 being released into the atmosphere. That's creating these greenhouse effect. That's what's probably bouncing the sun rays off and increasing this oven temp inside of our atmosphere. I guess there's ways to mitigate that through capturing the carbon. And as I'm reading, it's maybe an inefficient method. Spencer, could you talk a little bit about what that carbon capturing process might look like? And what I'm going to probably push back on you is to say, well, this seems like it's a massive undertaking. And is it even feasible to think about or do or tackle? Aren't there maybe other ways that we can tackle this problem in a more realistic or, on a 75 or 150 year scale? Maybe this carbon solution is a bit longer, but tell me more about what that is and, maybe even your involvement in it.
Sure. So you said a lot there, and I think that's really important to unpack that piece by piece. I think what's interesting is when you said that 14% of people now do not agree with climate change, that just means that 86% of people do, which is a huge transformation in public opinion that has taken place over the last handful of years. I could say when I came into this field, I remember it was 2012 when I said to myself, okay, I apparently really care about climate change. Let me go and make my career in this. And that's when I decided to go to grad school and move to Washington, D.C. and all of that. And in that time, it's really transformed. But I think what's really important here to understand is that the science is very, very clear. Public opinion and also having a thorough understanding of how greenhouse gases are driving climate change are two different things. And they're two different conversations, both equally valid, both important, because you need to have a productive conversation with stakeholders, which are human beings that are interfering with these systems and participating in these systems that are driving climate change. Yeah, for sure. Right. And so there's some really interesting work on this. I would note that the Yale Center for Climate Change Communication has done what's called the Six Americas study, which is that you can parse out your audiences into these 6 buckets. And you go all the way from the alarmed, which is like people like, oh my God, I'm never going to eat meat again. I'm never going to fly again. All the way to people that say, you can't really convince me in any world that this is happening. And then there's a lot of space in between. But there's also the important thing to understand, which is that carbon dioxide really is a principal driver here. But there are other important gases to note. That's methane, which come from cattle and cows, which is a huge component of that problem. And it captures somewhere between 20 and 30% the amount of heat per molecule as CO2 does. So it's a very nefarious gas. And then you also have your chlorofluorocarbons. You have your SOx and NOx, so different sulfur and nitrogen containing compounds that are all driving climate change, as well as surface level ozone and soot and things like that. So there's all these different processes, industrial processes that are driving the production of these gases that go up into the atmosphere and drive climate change. What's unfortunate is that the minority of these detractors get a disproportionately loud voice. And I think that there's ways to have this conversation that is productive. I think, what do you think is happening when you turn on your car? Do those gases disappear? Do they float off into space? You know not to hang out in your garage with the door closed. Why is that? Because of these noxious gases. Are they magically being transported to another universe? No. And you have to think that this is what's happening on an amazing scale, beyond what we can even comprehend every minute of every day, as cars and industry and other processes are taking place all over the world. And
so I do want to cut in here with a fun fact. 42% of our carbon dioxide emissions in human history have occurred between 1989 and now.
Right.
So
the huge part of the Industrial Revolution.
Just exactly. So even though we had the Industrial Revolution starting around 1750, so about 58% of our emissions are from 1750 to 1989. But from 1990 to today, we've done more than almost half of what we've done before that, right? So it took almost 250 years to reach what we've done in just 30 years.
Mike, what are the guys on the left saying when they say there's 12 years? Is it BS? Because it sounds like if all this has happened over the last 30 years, but we've got, 3,000 years of Earth history. I mean, why do they say that 12-year number? Are we going to die?
So what 12-year number? What, like
that's
the
what
rising of the tides
AOC
and stuff?
specifically says, that we are all going to be extinct in 12 years, right?
So it's funny because it's like if you look at what Al Gore's predictions are, and they're wildly off base, right? If you watch Inconvenient Truth, we should be running out of snow on the top of Mount Kilimanjaro by now. New York City should be getting close to underwater. All these things, right? Al Gore is not the IPCC, right? He is not the entire body of science. So actually, when we look at the IPCC models, they are actually sometimes a little wrong. They're too conservative. So climate change seems to be happening faster than we expected. So yes, models are not perfect, but they're actually been very predictive. So we have several different ones that are used in the IPCC reports, and these are different scientists trying to come up with their way to say, this is how we think climate change is happening, they're all remarkably accurate, and they're all very similar, and they're all painting towards the same picture, that global temperatures are rising, and it is because of human caused activity. So some of the evidence that we have, and this is what's so fascinating about science, is we come up with what we expect to happen, right? So here's theory, and then there's inferential evidence, and we get these magical things like sometimes Einstein developing theories of relativity that we prove 60, 70 years later because we've been waiting for the science to catch up. We have inferential evidence from temperature and climate history in the past. We know ours is significantly different. As Spencer put that phrase, is we're rising to the signal above the noise, right? So this is not random generation pattern. We're able to look at ice cores, right? So we're able to actually plunge deep into the cores in our caps and see what the atmosphere looked like. We're able to use, spectrophotometry and see what the atmosphere composition was then. And then we can use other inferential evidence, sediment cores, tree rings, pollen records, coral reefs. These are all things that will tell you, either their growth or their recession about what kind of climate is occurring there. We know that when temperatures are warm, trees tend to, spit out pollen more and reproduce. So we'll see that indicated in the pollen records. So these two inferential pieces of evidence, they corroborate each other, right? So we can look now and we can see our temperatures rising, and we know this, the pollen records go up. So when we look in the past and we get an ice core sample that says, this has the same carbon dioxide as this composition in history, we should see this temperature. Oh, look, the pollen records, the tree ring growth, it all suggests exactly that. So I would say that there is definitely plenty of alarmism. You're going to get people who are in, Stop the Oil, or if I'm probably butchering the name of that organization.
Keep it in the ground.
Just Stop Oil, right? So they're the people who are throwing, gluing their hands to the ground, throwing paint over these, priceless works of art and stuff like that. That's different from the climate science. That's different from climate policy. So, it's very easy to straw man, but let's be clear that those are not the scientists working in the field and the legislators and policymakers.
So you touched on how we're able to go into like geology and then also in a way agriculture with the trees and the pollen to understand the effects of what's happening in history. I obviously have a different media diet than you guys, right? If you guys hear the name Ben Shapiro, you probably run the other way to the bathroom. But what I would say is he's one of the 86% probably that now would agree, maybe reluctantly as a right-wing pundit, to say, yes, climate change is happening. Yes, it's a result of human behavior. But what he always says, and it's actually kind of intriguing to me, I even heard Lex Friedman mention this on one of his recent podcasts, was, hey, if the global temperature raises by 2 degrees in 100 years, why don't we just make the air conditioning a little better, right? Go see what they're doing in Saudi Arabia. They're producing this Nemo building, which is a $10 billion undertaking to build this all glass, glorified shopping mall high rise where you can live completely indoors in this totally arid climate that's 140 degrees Fahrenheit. You can't live there without it. So wouldn't modern technology, just to say, hey, screw it, we're going to make it 66 in here instead of 68 because I like to make it cold, right, with my AC.
I would love if it were that simple. So I think that there's really important to point out is that global warming kind of makes it sound like, oh, you're going to mean we're cozier. Mm-hmm. We're not gonna need our sweatshirt anymore. That there is a cascading effects is that when you raise greenhouse gases, you increase temperature. So increasing temperature increases evaporation over land, driving drought. It increases temperature of the oceans, and that increases storm intensity. It increases wildfire intensity. It's, people call it climate weirding because it's this disproportionate. Some areas of the world are actually going to maybe end up better off. Folks like Greenland, right? They're exposing more arable land and more temperate climates. But it's driving more intense heat in places like sub-Saharan Africa, in Central America. So it's this techno-optimism, as it's called, that we're just going to solve our way out of it. And it's great. I'm glad that folks in the Middle East might be doing that. But there are 2 to 3 billion people on this planet that don't have access to the resources that are going to protect them in quite the same way. So I think what's also important here is to think that all of the important issues that are important to conservatives are going to get worse by climate change. If you think migration is bad, imagine when it becomes unbearably hot in some of these areas. Imagine when there is a food crisis on top of a migration crisis driven by climate change, driven by more intense weather. So it's nice to think that we're going to solve our way out of it. And like the air conditioning, a lot of people say that. It's like, all right, we'll turn off our air conditioning. Well, it's not that simple. We're talking about effects on the whole natural system. Sea level rise isn't going to be solved by more air conditioning. And then there's the equity piece of it. You know, it's like you and I here in the first world have a different perspective on this than people that are trying to raise themselves out of poverty in developing nations. And I do want to come back to that 12-year thing. I think that unfortunately, what happens is that you have a narrative, and that it's, you know, we have 12 years to reduce emissions. And to Mike's point, this is really important because this is building to a crescendo right now. If we had begun to address this years ago, right? If in 1988 we had taken James Hansen's warning seriously, and we had really tried to make efforts on this, the marginal cost of doing something about climate change would have given us it would have been less expensive, would have given us more runway to deal with it. The problem is that as we're seeing the total amount, the cumulative amount of greenhouse gases accumulating in the atmosphere, it's like throwing your thermostat in your home. That is locked in heat. That is not going to be decreased unless we somehow suck that CO2 out of the atmosphere, which we could talk about carbon capture if you'd like. But the thing is that we're up against the wall because we haven't addressed this at a scale that is climate relevant. Now, every day that we delay and that we can't get our hands around these unabated emissions, it becomes more expensive. It's like, when is it easier to lose weight? When you have 20 pounds of extra fat, or when you have 120 pounds of extra fat? So it's a rough approximation, but that's approximately an analogy of where we are right now. It is called a climate crisis because whether you agree or disagree about the solutions, we have a spigot of greenhouse gases that is flowing into the atmosphere that we don't know how to turn off. And we are trying very, very hard in multiple different ways to try to turn off that spigot. But the long and the short of it is we don't know how to do that yet. So we're trying to close it as best we can. And the science is very clear that when, as Mike said, when you look at these cores, when greenhouse gases go up, temperature goes up. And it's not just temperature. It's this cascading effects into the natural world, into natural systems that creates scenarios that are detrimental to human development. On a like a big scale, you know, you're going to have climate migration, as I mentioned. But as an individual, you don't want more 100-degree plus humid days. You don't want more crazy storms that keep you inside and, you know, potentially pose a risk to you and your property. These are the individual components of climate change that will affect us in our daily lives.
So, Spencer, I understand what you're saying, and I do want to talk a little bit more about carbon capture and storage, CCS, actually, my own initials, a little close to my heart inherently. But listen, you shot down that air conditioning idea. I get it. The other kind of talking points that I've heard are that why would the Obamas buy a house on the coast of Martha's Vineyard if the sea level is going to rise, right? And okay, well, the average time to own a house is about 7 years. So I think that they probably would intend to sell it if there might be this mass migration as you're describing. And right, I'm a conservative, right? What does conservative mean? Maybe conservation. And I noticed, Mike, you might be wearing a shirt that alludes to that. But you know, there you go. This gentleman established the national parks and all that. Teddy Roosevelt, right? But I'm an Eagle Scout. I'm an outdoorsman. I've hiked significant, you know, northeast portions and southern portions of the Appalachian Trail, backpacking. And I actually commented that when I went last year in February, and I did about 100+ mile stretch by myself, and I was really looking forward to kind of getting out there and enjoying the air and the mountains and maybe seeing some animals. I did not see a single animal the entire week I was out there. Not a bear, not a deer. I didn't even really see squirrels, critters, birds. There was nothing out there. It was really actually eerie in times. And I kind of wonder, is this maybe due to, are they going to warmer weather? Are they going to colder weather? I wasn't sure what happened. It was at late February. It was like 60 degrees maybe in North Carolina and Georgia. But it was weird. I don't know if I want to tie this into that conversation, but it was, I love the outdoors. And like you kind of said, conservatives, hunting, fishing, all of this kind of stuff, you know, it's strange to me that they would so easily deny it. And maybe the reason is because it seems like the solutions that we have on the table right now are so insurmountably expensive. Are we really going to go and capture all of the CO2? I mean, at the end of the day, that's just tree food. So why would, you know, we're not saying that, maybe we are about other gases like methane, but it just sounds like, okay, are we going to go down the route of we're going to move everyone away from the coasts? Are we going to put an electric vehicle in everyone's garage? Or are we going to go up into space and try to blow a hole in the ozone to pump out all that carbon, right?
That
or
one.
is that's the one you like? Okay, so just tell me why.
So now, so this is where things get a little bit sticky, right? Because now we're talking about human behavior and human psychology and human nature. So you could talk about all the science you want, all right, right? Like, and the science is clear. You should drink more water and not smoke cigarettes and not eat junk food, but people still do it because we're emotional creatures. And so now when you're talking about what we ought to be doing to address this is where the contention lies, because like you said, a lot of like outdoors and conservation responsibility in the fact that we shouldn't be treating our atmosphere as an open air sewer. These are conservative values. And I think now that we're talking about sort of this other side, the solution side of it, we should be having better conversations. We can be having better conversations about climate change and about solutions to climate change. And I think the problem that I run into a lot is that the future of a climate neutral world, it sounds very restrictive. All of a sudden you're saying, oh, I can't eat what I want to eat. I can't travel where I want to travel. I don't have the liberty that I have right now. And this, this joke of like, well, I was driving down the highway, but my government allocation of gasoline just ran out. And so my car is going to turn off right here on the interstate. But I think that is a straw man argument. But it's all about creating a future of possibility. It is very encouraging to think like, you don't want to go when you buy your house, your next house, when you upgrade because we're upwardly mobile and things are going to get better for us, and that's a nice future that we all have for ourselves. You don't want to move to a community where you see a smokestack and your kids are at a higher likelihood of getting asthma, which is true if you live near an industrial area right now. So this idea of climate mitigation and heading in this direction, this is good for everyone for many different reasons. There's this idea of climate co-benefits, that instead of saying we're doing this for the betterment of our grandchildren and the climate that they're going to live in, it's just better to not have these pollutants in our life now. And that's something that we can get behind now. And also this idea of responsibility. Why is it that we're, if I said, Cooper, I'm going to move your house, right? And you've got, 1-800 got junk. So you could, or you could use this one company and it costs you X. I could do it for half of X. But I'm just going to throw it into the street. I'm just going to take it down to the river and throw it in the river. That's essentially what we're able to do with our gaseous emissions right now. And that is not a conservative value. So I think that we can have better conversations. And this is where it gets tough, is that it's not prescriptive, saying you ought to buy an electric car. That's not a conversation that's going to go well in some audiences. But that's why there's actually emotional labor that needs to go into these conversations. If you're trying to connect with someone about why this is important to you, research has shown that having value-driven conversations, we could come together and say, this is what we could agree on. For instance, we could agree on the importance of family, the importance of responsibility, the importance of holding those who are in power to account. I think these are things that we could all rally around. And then once you are able to land on common ground, then you can have more productive conversations on solutions. And the science is clear about what we've done and how we've contributed to climate change. But what the future holds, that is unwritten. And so that is for up to us to consider. And just one more point on this, that's where the nationally determined contributions. And there's also another acronym in there. It is common but differentiated responsibilities. And there's another part of it, common and respective capabilities. Common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities. Long jargon that says climate solutions aren't going to be the same everywhere. It's going to be location dependent. It's going to be situation, economy, and culturally dependent on what we do in order to bring our greenhouse gas emissions down.
I mean, it's interesting, right? You think of an individual car spitting out emissions and you think, hey, maybe it's like pissing in the ocean. It really doesn't make that big of a difference. And well, if everyone starts doing it, you end up with the Ganges River, and that's exactly what the problem is. Spencer, actually, you resonated with me. You found something that I was like, you're exactly right about that. You said you wouldn't want to move your house and build your family up right next to a big smokestack throwing emissions into the air. I mean, that's pretty common sense. I would imagine that would be 100% of people's responses. And I think that is what has maybe led to skepticism in the nuclear development field, because I was watching a video this week. It was some executive at General Motors. It was from 2017, and they had just released their new Chevy Volt, their electric vehicle they were so proud of. And they had this big ceremony where they plugged it in and they go, look, this car is being charged by electricity. So one of the journalists came over and he had just interviewed the municipal.
Where's the electricity coming from?
Exactly. The municipal agent. What is the power generation? Well, 95% coal powered in that city or that area. So it was like, yeah, well, you're driving a coal powered car essentially rather than a gasoline car. So is it even better? Is it not? Well, as Trump would say, it's beautiful, clean coal. So presumably that's fine. I mean, there you do kind of expose the hypocrisy as you go through the talking points. It's a little bit interesting.
So I could definitely touch on this. You know, I'm in the industry, and I always want to frame this as my opinions are my own and not that of my employer or any of my clients that I work with. But I'm in the electronics recycling industry, and you know we're blue collar workers predominantly. A lot of right of center positions in this industry because it's economic and value based, right? We have to do this for profit. So I think that's where a lot of the opposition against climate change efforts do come from on the right side, right? Is the cost of these and the impediments to economic activity. So we have kind of an adage in the electronics recycling industry, right? When we're following the reduce, reuse, hierarchy and recycle hierarchy, you have the dirtiest mining operation is the dirtiest point of manufacturing, right? That's where we get our raw materials from. But the dirtiest refurbishing operation is cleaner than the cleanest recycling operation. And the dirtiest recycling operation is still cleaner than the cleanest mining operation. So it's all about mitigating impacts. There's no perfect solution to everything, but we're trying to mitigate that, right? So in the instance, I'll kind of tie this back to electric cars is, I own a Prius, and I actually think that's a perfect middle ground, right? If we can change the grid, that takes a lot longer to get away from, say, an entirely 95% powered coal grid. But what I can do tomorrow is I could cut my gasoline consumption in half. I can cut my industrial solvent use in half. In the lifetime ownership of my car, I only have to do routine maintenance on my Prius. I don't have to change the brake pads as often because I have that recharging mechanism in there. I don't have to put oil and lubricants as often. So I'm getting like 50 gallons to the mile, right, which is about twice the average of a car. I'm using half as many emissions when I drive my vehicle around, and that's like an easy to reach solution right there. A lot of my industry is focused on, what is the most economic way to meet those sustainable options, right?
Well, the same way that we might have to reframe the delivery of the words climate crisis, right? It sounds like the words recycle, people forget reduce, reuse, recycle.
Right.
It's actually third in the recycling hierarchy.
Exactly.
And it's the name. So
it's the last choice, exactly.
Yeah, right. And so, well, when I think of electric vehicles, and you mentioned less wear and tear, one of the complaints that people have is, well, they're going to run out of juice in the middle of the road. There's not enough charging
Battery
stations
anxiety,
or the infrastructure, right? And Spencer, you touched on how maybe the conspiracy theorists say you're going to run out of government mandated mileage. Well, in these electric vehicles, in these smart vehicles, couldn't the government just go and shut you down in the middle of the road and leave you rolling if you have the wrong thoughts or if you say the wrong things on your social media? They might have more control. That's some of the hesitation. But hey, is that BS? Likely, right? They could probably go and shut down your computerized internal combustion engine car today, as you alluded to. So
right, yeah.
I think a lot of it is really unfounded, and it comes from a sense of fear, but not a fear that the climate is changing, a fear that their life will have to change. And that's a very maybe short-sighted way of looking at it. Why don't you talk to us more about the methods of carbon capture? Because that's obviously what the root of the issue is, right? We're drilling, we're digging, we're mining, we're refining, we're burning, and we're releasing this CO2. So you mentioned before you wanted to blast a hole in the atmosphere, and maybe that was facetious after my comment, but
that was not my testimony.
Right, that was my testimony. It was a leading question, Your Honor. But talk to me more about what that process looks like, and what do we do? Take a giant vacuum, a Dyson, and put it against the atmosphere like a pool scrubber, and it kind of just goes along all day to pick up the carbon?
Well, I'm glad to chat about that. And also I should say, and I should have said this at the beginning, that all of my opinions and perspectives are of my own opinions and perspectives. They do not reflect the opinions nor perspectives of any of my affiliations. So I will say that. But so I presently work in the carbon capture and storage industry, and carbon capture and storage are a suite of technologies that capture carbon either before they hit the atmosphere at the industrial site, or what is called direct air capture. They are taken out of the ambient air. And so carbon capture really it comes back down to climate change. So where the carbon capture industry is getting a lot more play right now because there is a lot of supportive policies that have been enacted over the last handful of years all over the world to help bring this nascent industry up to commercial scale. And people say, well, it's a nascent industry, it's a new technology. Not so much. Carbon capture technology has been around for 50 years, and it was pioneered through enhanced oil recovery, which is where you capture CO2 from these industrial processes, such as oil refining, and then you take that CO2, and then you can actually use it to squeeze further hydrocarbons out of depleted oil and gas fields. However, they also learned when they did this that CO2 stays underground. So what we're looking towards now is a transition in the industry where it's called dedicated geologic storage. We're capturing carbon and we're putting it right back underground so that that carbon does not heat the atmosphere, that it does not serve as a greenhouse gas anymore. And this is important because there are many critical industries to human development. And this includes iron, steel, still natural gas processing and petroleum development. But we're also talking about pulp and paper, chemical production, fertilizer production. And these are industries that are critical to human development. And we're only going to see this demand grow, particularly as we are meeting our sustainable development goals through the UN, and as more and more people want to have energy security, regular security, energy and resource sovereignty, all of these things.
Right. Whereas people in the third world want to have a first world type of lifestyle, right? They're going to require all of these things that we have.
We all want to have a better life for ourselves and for our children. And so these are industries where we know that they're only going to go up, and then there's process emissions involved with them and combustion emissions. And they're called process because they come out of the process. That we don't have another process where we could create these materials that doesn't produce emissions. So CCS, carbon capture and storage, takes these emissions before they hit the atmosphere at a rate of around 90 to 95% in some cases, that we're able to capture this amount of CO2, and then basically either use it in this utilization, that's CCUS, or the S, which is we put it into geologic formations in which have been highly characterized and are very well understood to hold that carbon so that it won't leak back out and get up into the atmosphere and cause more climate change. So to your question, is that expensive? Yes. So there's innovative policy and business models in funding this, but this is where things get really tricky because I would love to be a libertarian, to be honest with you, but I can't be, because as the Federalist Papers point out, if men were angels, we wouldn't need government, but we're not. People are making a profit, and then institutions, there's like this sort of moral decay where eventually you just get them just doing what's best for them, and so we need these government and policy structures in order to help move us in this direction. Because again, who wouldn't want a carbon-free and emission-free industrial facility? And CCS can help us move us there. Now, I will say that there's the appropriate role for CCS, as there is the appropriate role for all of these other technologies and solutions. It's not a blanket statement. It's not a one-size-fits-all. This whole idea of like electric cars in every garage or solar panels on every roof, that's not going to be the solution for everyone that makes best sense. It is part of the solution, right? And I think what we need to talk about are behavioral changes, and then systematic efficiencies, and then supplement, and then fuel switching, which is getting a renewables penetration. But there's always going to be that last band of around 10 to 15% of emissions, and even in an ideal world, where we're going to need fossil fuel baseload power, or we have these process emissions that we can't innovate our way out of. And that's where CCS can play a role.
I mean, it's very interesting. You mentioned that the industry has to catch up to kind of make the costs make sense. And I'll be honest, I lost a lot of money in Sun Edison. It was one of the first larger investments I ever made. They're the largest, or were the largest photovoltaic manufacturer. And well, they went belly up, bankrupt. Everyone went to zero because the cost didn't make sense. So in something like this renewable, like you mentioned, it's not the one size fits all solution, right? But even still, the costs and the processes that it takes to manufacture these systems photovoltaic cells specifically, that doesn't outweigh the benefit that it actually incurs. So it's a little bit strange to me, and a little bit of maybe obfuscation of the problem. But to that same token, right now, and here's the chart, there's 60% of our power generation is liquid natural gas, oil, and coal. So then when you look a little bit lower, it's just about 20% and 20% with nuclear power, and then the other option would be renewables, right? So my question would be, if we're trying to advance all of these industries, why wouldn't we try to advance a specific industry? In my case, nuclear. I think I hear a lot of people on the right say, hey, this might be actually a more suitable option, a more realistic option. People don't realize we're using this. This is 20% of our nation's power generation. So why have we not seen this proliferation of nuclear power? Is it truly just because of the psychology behind it?
That's a great question. I wish I had better answers for you, but I would say, yeah, it's like there's definitely the psychology aspect of it. Just as we said, I wouldn't want to live right next door to a smokestack. I don't know if you want to live in the neighborhood of a nuclear reactor, and even if you think that's really great.
It's the curse of NIMBY, right? Not in my backyard, and I face with that all the time. You know, I review permits and licenses and registrations for various states. I think people would be really shocked to learn what an air permit means. It doesn't mean that you're not allowed to emit anything. It tells you what you're permitted to emit. So with every industrial process, there's an economic value to it. But what we're trying to change, I guess, in the paradigm with climate change and decarbonization is to realize these externalized costs, right? When we burn a fossil fuel, there's lots of subsidies and policies in the way, as Spencer kind of made the metaphor too, is, you know, we treat our air like just an open air sewage, right? If all of the costs could be realized by consuming fossil fuels, consumers would be able to better make that decision and would actually realize that the value is better aligned with sustainable products and things like that. But like I said, as it boils down to NIMBY, you know, nuclear is an excellent power source that's come tremendous ways in terms of safety and efficiencies, and yet we're you know, people don't want it in their backyard, so they're so afraid of pushing any kind of you know, policy changes, because that's really the only thing standing in the way is policy. But I will say that recently there is another nuclear power plant that is expected and looking at reopening right now. They got a $1.5 billion grant through the Inflation Reduction Act, and hopefully within the next year or two they're doing a review. We might see another power plant online in America.
Yeah, interesting. I've heard that they have much lower emissions, or even net zero, than compared
carbon
to
neutral. Yeah.
But what I've also heard to that point, and Spencer, I'm going to ask you. I've heard that, and this was at the time when Trump had that famous quote where he said "beautiful, clean coal," which is obviously a ridiculous statement. But I think the goal in saying that was something that you alluded to. These carbon capture systems that are attached to a smokestack, for lack of a better metaphor, right? They are sucking up like 90 to 95% of that carbon. So is there a chance that, let's say that we keep digging and we ignore those offsets of digging, but literally burning these terrible fossil fuels, is there a chance that we could get to 100% carbon capture and by using these systems eventually? Or is it kind of like, listen, we've really exhausted all of our ability to withdraw this carbon. We really need to switch to a different method here because we're never getting to 100%.
These are all great questions. And so there's actually a outcome of COP28, which just took place, was it in Abu Dhabi, or I wish I knew exactly where it was. So an outcome of the most recent conference of the parties, again, through the UNFCCC, which is now following up on the Paris Agreement, ratcheting up ambition, strengthening this system to help reduce emissions mitigation, is that there were three important outcomes. Number one was to triple the amount of renewable energy deployment by 2030, double the amount of energy efficiency by 2030, and efficiencies account for a lot of emissions. And number three is to move away from fossil fuels, which is very contentious, considering that this was hosted in the Middle East. But there is this sense that we need to move away from fossil fuels as the dominant mode of energy production. But it's also important to remember that originally, fossil fuels were our savior. They have alleviated so much creature suffering, human and animal, because you're able to have a tractor and you don't have to lug your goods and services, right, on a mule or a horse, but you can do that in a machine that's powered by fossil fuels. So this was really a brilliant thing for humanity, and actually they are quite fantastic. The energy density, the stability at atmospheric and room temperature, atmospheric pressure and room temperature, they're quite extraordinary. And that's the reason that they are the bedrock of our economy today. However, being used at the scale that they're being used today is causing a problem. It's just like too much of any good thing is no longer a good thing. It goes back to the diet thing, right? It's like you need your balance of carbs and fats and protein. If you have too much of any one thing, then you're out of balance, and that's not healthy for you. So
from a statistic point, I like to jump in real quick. Is that they say that we have about 100 years worth of natural gas and oil under American soil that we could be exporting, and I would say, great, that sounds like 100-year oil reserve. That sounds strategic, and that's not something that we should be tapping so heavily, right? So it's about building an entire comprehensive policy, and as Spencer's saying, is like fossil fuels can be a component of it, but they can't be the major component of it.
And to your question, thanks, Mike. But to your question, Coop, there's a sense of we could develop these systems that capture a high degree of carbon. They could be expensive, but we need to put a price on carbon for this. And these voluntary and compliance markets represent a kind of price on carbon. And then the other component of all of these, the 100%, how do you get to 100%? If you're able to maximize efficiency, you're able to deploy a lot of non-fossil assets, you're able to capture carbon, but then there's still, again, this last band of emissions, as well as legacy emissions, the fact that we're still pumping these gases into the atmosphere today. This is where direct air capture, or DAC, comes into play, as well as BECCS, bioenergy with CCS, this idea that, you're using plant material, you're combusting it to form energy, and then you're capturing that carbon as well. So DAC is incredibly expensive. It's incredibly expensive because the lower your concentration of CO2, the more expensive it is to take out of that partial pressure of your gases.
Just to simplify, so it's like if you set a vacuum at the top of the smokestack, you know where all that carbon is. But if you set it at the very top of the atmosphere, well, obviously there's less volume of carbon at that area.
Yeah, very, very roughly, that's approximately it, right? So it's cheaper to do what's called point source CCS, which is right there at the facility before it hits your smokestack, before you're venting it, as the industry says. And then if you're doing direct air capture, that's incredibly expensive. However, it is the only way that we're going to reduce the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere right now. And there's it's very clear that we're driving temperatures up by driving CO2 up. And even if we shut everything down as fast as we can, there's what's called the legacy emissions. There's, the first Model T produced CO2 that's still floating around the atmosphere. And when you flip on your lights and you turn on your car, that's CO2 that's going up there right now. So direct air capture is a way of dealing with what you would call unavoidable emissions, in a world where we can't, innovate our way out of all of these emissions, but also they capture the legacy emissions as well. So these are technologies that have been around for quite some time, but they're getting a lot of traction now. There's some facilities that are opening up for the very first time around the world. And then you're going to hear some really interesting work from these DAC hubs that are being funded by DOE in partnership with American companies that are going to be essentially, like big fake trees. They're big machines that are sucking carbon out of the atmosphere and then storing them in geologic formations underground.
That's pretty cool. It makes me think of those weird cell phone towers, though, that you can pretty obviously tell are not trees. And it's like, oh, come on, guys, just make it
once
look
you
like
see it, you can't unsee it.
It's like a low-budget spy film, right? Like, you're not doing a good job at hiding.
Right, like there's like three kids in a trench coat. Exactly. You can tell what you're doing.
There would be no need to hide these facilities. And they're going to be in industrial areas where it's very clearly, more industrial equipment. There's no need to kind of hide that. But I think as we're wrapping up here, I think it's important to kind of come back to this call to action and that there's opportunity here. I mean, it's called the climate crisis by some, but we should do a better job of framing this as the climate opportunity. Electric cars are objectively better in many ways than gas-powered vehicles. It's better to live in a world where you have cleaner air and cleaner water than dirtier air and dirtier water. It's better to know that we can provide for many using less, and that we are being respectful of our natural resources and of the people around us, that we're not doing this. We're not just outsourcing, excuse me, our environmental problems, which is essentially what we've done through globalization. I don't want my big factory producing my widget down the street, so let's put that in Southeast Asia or in China, for example. So these are hopeful things, and it costs money. It costs money to do anything good, but we should also find that there's innovative ways to have this paid for, and we should hold those that have the resources to account. I mean, there's this big debate over tax the rich. I think a lot of people would agree that we should have tax reform and that those who should be paying their fair share aren't. And there are ways of financing this in a way that is equitable. But we have to realize that in order to get to where we're going, there are complex decisions to be made. There are difficult questions. If this were easy, we probably would have solved for it, but we haven't. So, I mean, this is a call to action for all of us. And I'll remind us that there is this runaway train that we haven't yet figured out how to stop putting greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. And unfortunately, that is the burden of our generation, that this is a reality. And it's going to be up to us to figure out how to address that.
So so I understand it clearly, I do remember Trump talking about pulling out of the Paris Climate Agreement. And then I guess Biden put us back in. Is that accurate?
That is accurate. He pulled us out. And Biden and I think it took effect like the day before the 2020 election. That's how it worked, because he had to pull us out, and then it took 3 years to take effect. And so that was, I guess it was January of 2020. So then it took effect in January of 2023. And
very recently, then we've rejoined it under Biden.
Yeah, exactly. And then Biden, his first day in office, signed an executive order that put us back in. And this was a political stunt, right? And I think it plays into this fact that a lot of it is theater, that people had this misunderstanding, deliberate misunderstanding by many of the Paris Agreement, that it's going to drive energy costs up for us, and that we're going to get the short end of the stick while we're giving money to these polluting nations and these least developed nations, and there's no accountability for that money, and all these straw man arguments around that. But again, I would say that the beauty of the Paris Agreement is that we're not obligated to do anything except report what we're up to. And this idea of contribution, submission, and review, so that everyone can have a clear idea of what every individual nation, every actor on the global stage is doing. It provides transparency. It provides opportunity for collaboration and creativity, in fact.
And provides a net benefit to the globe. I mean, listen, I agree with you. I would push back probably that, hey, if we are funding, or let's say Switzerland is funding projects in Thailand and taking credit, presumably, right, their costs are going up domestically for them. And that could be the same case here, right? Whereas we call it elective, of course, the United States is going to be the first one to run our pockets, as the kids say, and give the other countries our bread. So it's interesting to me that there's definitely it's a net good, right? But it also will have some impacts. But maybe as we're kind of saying here, the way that it's tracked and joining these methods and working together and actually leading, which is a major aspect of the Paris Agreement, right? These developed nations must lead and set an example. So we really do have to do that. I just have one last question for you. We talked a little bit about alarmism, and I'm curious if you believe people like Greta Thunberg, or her specifically, has she been a net benefit for the climate movement over the last 5 or 6 years, or has she been a net negative in kind of what we've talked about, where this alarmism and this in-your-face kind of need to berate politicians and sit in the middle of the street and throw tomato soup at paintings, right? It creates that knee-jerk reaction to kind of pull the other side out of this and say, we need to ignore these freaks. So would you say that she's been a net good or a net bad, her specifically?
So I'm not going to pass judgment on Greta Thunberg. I will say that there is this culture now where they're throwing paint at priceless pieces of art, and they're gluing their hands to the road. Personally, I do not think that this is effective activism. I don't think you're winning supporters in this way. I don't think you're winning people to join your cause. That's unfortunate, because now it's almost synonymous that, these climate protesters have. I think it's foolish. I think it's childish. And I think there's better ways to engage in this conversation and to lobby your government to peacefully protest.
Right.
and affect change. There's actually quite a number of ways to do that. And I think what we've seen is that the grassroots movement around climate has really evolved and matured over the last few years. When I was starting out my journey, I remember it was 2012, and I'm sitting at my parents' kitchen table on my computer watching James Hansen's testimony to Congress and researching climate change and thinking, how are more people not alarmed by this? If you really think about it, how are people not just totally thinking about this all the time? And that began my journey. And I think that there's a natural progression where you start alarmed when you really put all the pieces together and realize that it's a runaway train, and that with the rise of China, India, Brazil, and all of these fugitive emissions elsewhere that are not being accounted for, that it's a really scary place to be. But there are many places to engage. Since 2012, there are many more organizations, there are many more opportunities to enter into that activism space. Again, I think it comes down to having better, more mature, more constructive conversation, which is a lesson that we could learn across our discourse. That climate notwithstanding, we can stand to have better conversations. And again, I think it comes back to how do you engage with different audiences, maybe coming down to value-based conversation, being able to align on values first, find your common ground, and then talk about things that you might disagree about and that are contentious. Is she that benefit? It's hard to say. It is certainly hard to say. It is encouraging to see that this has become a top line headline conversation over the last few years, and deservedly so. This idea of like, are things going to crash and burn in 12 years? Maybe that is mischaracterizing what's happening, but every day we don't do something about this, it gets worse. And if you take a look at some of these graphs, and maybe this is a great time to insert it into the podcast here, if you take a look at these graphs from the IPCC, basically every degree of warming, just it gets worse. To use a layman term, it's just like that the more greenhouse gases we're putting into the atmosphere, the more warming we cause, the more severe storms, the more unpredictability, the more ice melt that we get, the more sea level rise we get, the more habitat loss and species loss that we get, the more disruption to human systems we get. So it's important to note that there is an urgency around this. But, I think saying that the world is going to fall apart in 12 years, that's misleading. I think we're going to get by.
Yeah, that's when the locust storms come and the river of blood. Mike, you'll probably agree with me when I say the alarmism or this extremism, right? It's similar to when someone like Marjorie Taylor Greene says, look at the laptop, we have to impeach Joe Biden, right? And it's like, wait a minute, there's some legitimacy to what you're saying here, but you're really doing political theater. So it pushes the other side to ignore the evidence that's presented, and it becomes this political asset. So, Mike, do you think that the climate discussion is just another political piece in the puzzle to say, get me elected or get my opponent out of office because I'm going to do better than him? But they have a vested interest, like the homelessness crisis, to keep this thing going because, well, it's a great talking platitude. So what do you think about that? Is it going to be solved, or is it going to be pushed forward as this bargaining chip?
I think it is, unfortunately, a very useful asset class to be exchanging in negotiations, because there is this characterization that is unfortunately made now that the economic activity is always at the expense of any kind of environmental efforts, and we're trying to change that paradigm, and we're doing so successfully. I think that there is very positive changes, because with the Inflation Reduction Act, about 80% of the funding that's been dispersed so far has been going towards red districts. At the end of the day, I know that they'll happily take the free government money and then say, look at all the jobs and industry we brought into the state. I don't care what the reason is. I don't care if they're taking credit for it. I just like to see the ends kind of justify the means, right? So they're putting in sustainable industries. They're putting in solar, wind, and all the industries that manufacture those technologies and support those technologies. We're getting there. I think the conversation has changed, and you kind of see some on the right starting to come back to, you know, like the conservation aspect of being a conservative, right? This is our beautiful environment. When I travel around the world, especially to Europe, things I can appreciate going to Europe is it's very compact. They don't have this, you know, beautiful land preserved anymore. They have these very tiny parks. Even Central Park in New York City is incredibly impressive compared to the many parks that you see all around the European continent. The only place I've ever seen the kind of conservation and or beauty of the land that they have is in Argentina when I had the pleasure of visiting there. It's just such a massive, large country on that scale. Let's preserve one of the most unique and beautiful things about our country, and it doesn't have to be at the expense of industrial activity. It just comes with smart policy and planning. You know, we can get there.
Yeah. Well, guys, I really appreciate this. This is an amazing conversation that's totally informative. So, Spencer, maybe there's going to be an opportunity to have you back if there's been some development in this world or some important, you know, thing that happens. Maybe this earthquake we experienced in the Northeast yesterday is some sort of way connected to climate change. Of course, those claims got community noted on X, so I don't know if they're accurate. But no, seriously, you guys are a wealth of knowledge, the both of you, and the work that we put in to prepare for this is definitely something that, you know, helps us understand the issue. And listen, I'm the first to say, and to my followers, because now I will address you, please treat this seriously. I don't think that this is a partisan issue. I don't think that this is something that we need to back away from and say how ridiculous or trade this for, you know, a border wall. This is something that will lead to worse problems, worse immigration, no more beautiful nature, a terrible amount of food and agriculture problems that will come. So thank you guys again. Please follow, subscribe, like. This has been Elevated Thoughts.